Hi, this is Al from Albopepper.com, and today I'm looking at the results of an experiment I've been conducting for the last month, trying out some different potting mixes in my Albo-Stein sub-irrigated container, just to show you real quickly how this setup works. You have a 105 count Clorox wipe container, 32 ounce Dannon yogurt container with some holes for aeration, a couple holes in the bottom where I have some shoelaces placed that are able to wick up water that's sitting in here. This can hold a few cups of water while still allowing this container to have a little bit of some gap to have some air for proper aeration so that it's not completely waterlogged. This just fits down in there. Put in your potting mix, and you can start things even from seeds. That's actually how these were started. But what I was doing was trying to figure out if there are certain potting mixes that are better or worse as far as the plant yield, the viability. In retrospect, right from the beginning, I put myself at quite a disadvantage because the amount of fertilizer that I use an organic fertilizer. It's probably about 4 times the amount of what the manufacturer actually recommends. So what I found was initially the seeds, they germinated, but the seedlings had a very difficult time being able to extract moisture from the soil because of the high levels of nutrients. And so it took a lot of misting from the top to really get the seedlings to be able to grab hold and then be able to start to grow. And even at that, I had some mixed results with what I did find. The best thing would have been to have used probably about a 1/4 amount of the fertilizer that I did. But some of these mixes were able to yield better results than others, and so at the same time I was able to observe that despite the adversity of having high nutrient content, maybe high salt levels, some mixes were able to still allow for resilient plant growth once they got past that initial stage of being very, very small, tender seedlings. So I want to show some epic failures here. This doesn't even really deserve to be listed with the experiment, but what I used here was just a heavy perlite mix. I was actually concerned about the mixes sucking up too much water and making the plants too waterlogged, giving them too much water stress. So I was focusing on putting in aggregates like perlite and vermiculite to try to make sure there's enough aeration. Here I was using a substantial amount of perlite, a little bit of some peat moss, a couple types of Coir or Coco, and some vermiculite. I have all the different mixes that I used on my website, but I got one seed that germinated and it just fell flat on its face. But the big reason why this doesn't even really deserve to be counted in here is because I was thinking, wouldn't it be cool to have even a higher amount of fertilizer? So this actually has double the amount of all the rest of these. So there are 2 different sets of variables going on. So it really doesn't count to be included in the experiment because I didn't isolate a single variable with this container. It has 6 tablespoons of an organic fertilizer where these all have 3 in all of them. But I got no results with this. Now, what I was really surprised with, I wanted to try 2 different types of Coir. And so the type of Coir number 1 was a block of dry Coir that you can order, say, from Amazon.com. Go on there, get this maybe 10-pound block, and then you can hydrate it, dump a bunch of water on it, it expands, it soaks up the water great. But I was really surprised that although I did get some seeds germinating, some seedlings were started, at a certain point I stopped watering everything from the top because I realized, you know, this is sub-irrigated. The water should be coming up from the bottom. I shouldn't be through the entire experiment watering from the top. Once the seeds are actually able to sprout and get going, I stopped. Probably after a week and a half, maybe around 10 days, I wasn't misting from the top anymore. And what I found was this mix, which is all Coir, this is the dried block of Coir. It's heavy, it has a lot of water in here, but when you start to fill down through from the top, you have to go down probably about 2 inches before you can really see some substantial moisture. So the whole top layer here just would always stay dry, and of course your seedling starts out right at the top layer, so it never got roots that went down far enough to really benefit from the moisture that was further down. So this Coir that I got from Amazon in of itself isn't good enough to use in one of these containers. It has to be used in tandem with other things, especially if you're starting from seed. So this is Coir number 1, which was my control. This is also Coir number 1 with some perlite added. Very dismal results. I have some seedlings here that are just trying to hold on. A couple that are just completely dried out. Here, once again, Coir number 1. This has a mix of perlite and vermiculite. I had a little bit of some better vigor with one of these. It's hard to say if it was just genetic, maybe a particularly resilient seed, or if it had to do with the vermiculite itself that was added in here. But when you fill from the top, though, you can see that it's very dry as you go down the first inch and a half, maybe even 2 inches. It's almost bone dry. So the mix that I formulated with this particular type of Coir, it doesn't have the wicking capability. The capillary action doesn't occur to really draw up the moisture like you might imagine, because Coir does absorb water very easily. It doesn't get hydrophobic like peat moss does when it dries out. But now, speaking of peat moss, this is once again Coir number 1, but this is the Coir number 1 that also has 2 cups of peat moss mixed in. So just by having those 2 cups of peat moss, I had a little bit of some better moisture absorption. And it's still a little bit dry at the top, but I can feel moisture as I get down. I can get to some moisture a little bit quicker. And of course you can see I did have a healthy radish that was able to get established and to grow here. This is one of my biggest ones. But most of the growth was top growth. That's all the more I got from the bottom, I guess. So that's everything that used Coir number 1. Now I want to look at my peat moss blends before I get to the second type of Coir. This is peat moss with perlite and vermiculite. Had a couple radishes. Did okay. It's dry at the top, but there is some moisture about half of an inch down. This is peat moss with Coir number 2 and perlite and vermiculite, and this actually is a little more moist. Has some mediocre, some decent results. You know, there's some growth here. And this is peat moss with Coir number 1 with perlite and vermiculite. Not quite as good as the last one. It's okay. So as for the second Coir that I tested out, all 4 of these samples were productive. This was a Coir that I bought locally from a hydroponic shop in a bag. It hadn't been dried in a block shape, so I didn't have to hydrate it. my control had probably the biggest radish that I had out of the whole batch. Very large, especially considering how, you know, it's in this real small container. It was real close to the side. I was real pleased with the results. And, you know, I had all three of these that germinated in this one. This was that Coir that also had peat moss, perlite, and vermiculite in it. And then here's that Coir with perlite and vermiculite. I had germination on all three. The one side, these seedlings weren't able to really take off, but same here. I had germination in all three sections. Only one of them really got established, but I had germination in all three sections on all four of these samples using that Coir. It was kind of surprising. One thing I will say about the Coir is that it says that it's ready for fertilization. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of fertilizers that are built into it. So, you know, in a situation where maybe you're over fertilizing like what I did, that probably helped out. It's very fibrous, has good wicking characteristics, seemed to work well when I did use aggregates, but even just without any aggregates at all, like it seemed to do very well. I think that it's a good candidate for being used in this type of a container. And of course, I'm interested in trying more things with it. Does using peat moss or not using peat moss, does using aggregate or no aggregates, no perlite, no vermiculite, does that seem to make a difference? Well, not a lot. Really, the control had one of the biggest, had the biggest radish, but then of course you had a couple that weren't really able to do anything, where here this one had peat moss, it had perlite, it had vermiculite. It didn't have the biggest radish, but you had three samplings that were all at least growing. So at this point, I'd have to say that you can use some perlite, some vermiculite, you can use some peat moss, you can use different kinds of Coir, but if you're relying solely on Coir, pay attention to what kind you're getting. Some of them may not absorb water from the bottom all the way to the surface as well. This stuff, I have a link on my site to the two different types. This is Coir number 2. I have that on my website if you want to know what brand that was. If you want to try that out. But, you know, I had decent results just using peat moss. So I'm ready to try a different experiment, maybe looking at 2 samplings of mix, and within those 2 samplings trying a variety of fertilizers, like different types perhaps, but certainly different amounts. Not using nearly as much, maybe using something around this amount and then something even more, but using it in a potting mix that I've seen good results with, and seeing where I can go from there. These containers, they're nice. So give them a shot if you have that ability. If you know, you're maybe running a classroom, or you just want something you can sit on your windowsill, not have to water every single day. These can hold several cups of water in the bottom, so that's nice. But keep in mind, as your plants get bigger and they do well, they're going to be using water. The transpiration rates are going to be increasing. You won't just have evaporation off the soil line, but all this surface area of all the leaves are going to be releasing water. So you're going to be using up water faster. And just don't neglect the containers. It can be easy to do that, and before you know it, they're bone dry. Then you got to rehydrate your mix, and that's never good. So just be careful about that. It's easy to get used to being lazy. You could go for a week, 2 weeks not have to water, but then all of a sudden your plants are growing, and it's not like that anymore. You got to water every few days. So, well, I appreciate you checking out my review on my results with my potting mixes, and I look forward to trying some more things and hopefully having some good things that I can share, things that maybe you don't want to do and things that you do want to do to ensure maximum success.